Hello everybody. My name is Mirit Hoffman. I'm an elder law lawyer and a gerontologist, and my focus is mainly helping senior citizens when they reach significant junctions in their lives. And I'm talking about estate planning, such as preparing wills and enduring power of attorney, sometimes guardianship issues, anything to do with financial planning for people when they are getting married for the second or their third time, second and third relationships, and also advising on estate planning for people that have dual citizenships, Israel and the US. And for my broad exposure with this age group, which is mainly senior citizens, I've noticed that there are a lot of other topics that should be discussed that are just as important. And therefore, I have this podcast called Golden Topics Significant Crossroads for Seniors, where I discuss with other professionals other issues that impact their lives. And today we have Ben Maimon talking about structuring your investments for transition. So first of all, Ben, thank you so much for joining me today. And please introduce yourself.
My pleasure. I'm very pleased to be here, Mirit. So basically, I've had about 30 years, over 35 years of experience as an advisory and investment professional. I grew up in Seattle, lived in the New York area, and worked there for about 20 years before moving to Israel in 2005. And coming on 10 years ago in 2015, launched Maimon Wealth Management. So Maimon Wealth Management is an independent licensed portfolio management company that we're licensed in Israel. We also, for U.S. residents, we also happen to be registered with the SEC in the United States. And our practice really principally focuses on advising U.S. citizens who live in Israel, their families, people who live here, people who live in the States who then have family here as well. Importantly, we don't work for a bank or a brokerage firm or for a product company. We're an independent firm and manage the accounts, or rather the portfolios in their accounts. So those include family trusts, investment accounts, and joint accounts in the United States, as well as US dollar and shekel portfolios in Israeli banks. And we also, as we've done, coordinate with US and Israeli tax and legal advisors and pension advisors to try and make sure that the clients have a really comprehensive solution for what they do. I just say one thing that I'm very pleased to be discussing structuring your investments in transition, because that's really what we end up helping our clients with when we think about what are we there for our clients. We're there to help them in their lives, and really lives, I think everyone's lives are filled with transitions and changes. And as Hemingway once wrote when he was asked about a change that befell him, they said, how did it happen? He said, it happened two ways, gradually and then suddenly. And I think that's really, really an important message to keep in mind, because we really, in planning for our lives, we have to be able to plan for changes that can happen gradually or suddenly, and that we're really set up to deal with those. So our primary role is to help with our clients to make sure that their affairs are structured appropriately. And that includes coordinating with legal and tax advisors to make sure they have the right mechanisms in place, structuring their investment portfolios to make sure that they are, risk appropriate for their needs, as well as structuring their accounts for ease of management and administration, whether it be them or other family members that are going to help them in the future.
Well, it sounds like really important stuff. I really like that quote about suddenly and gradually. It's so true. So true. So let's start. What are some of the biggest financial mistakes you see people make, and how do you think they can avoid them?
Right. So I think, there's generally something referred to as a confirmation bias, right? There are a number of behavioral biases that many humans are prone to in terms of how they process information. And one of them is called the confirmation bias, which is to the extent that we view our current situation in the context of what's happened in our beliefs in the past, and then we extrapolate them forward. And so it's especially relevant today, where we've had, and most investors, especially those in the US stock market, have had decades of phenomenal returns, and generally, to the extent that there have been corrections, they've bounced back very quickly, and therefore they evaluate the risks that they have with the sort of realities that they know, and without necessarily having an honest acknowledgement of the risks that really exist and that we've seen sort of over the longer period of time investing in such investments. And that can relate to a market, but it can also relate to sort of individual holdings. And then you could have a situation where individuals end up having a really oversized allocation to a market or an individual stock that's probably most would not consider really appropriate. So I have a client whose broader family, they really obtain most of their family wealth through the appreciation of one stock over 40 years. And the family, the broader family, continues to hold about 80% of their wealth in one publicly traded stock of a company which they have no direct relationship with. So it's not as though they worked there, know the industry, would it's just that happened, their grandma and grandfather bought it really well 40 years ago, and they now have a mantra of, "We'll never sell that stock. You just don't sell it, you let it go." And that could be appropriate when it's smaller and doesn't represent the significant risk to sort of the well-being of the family. But when it comes to the point where very substantial wealth all in one stock, we don't know what can go wrong, but it wouldn't be the first time that something's gone wrong, and then you have really an oversized risk in that. The other area is, which may be more relevant, is the stock market, and particularly the U.S. stock market for many of your audience. I think to the extent that they come from the United States, we'll talk about some element of its, in a minute, but the experience of the stock market investors over the last, 30, 40 years has been that things go up, and when they've come down, whether it was in the great financial crisis, 2008, 2020, with COVID, 2022, when inflation spiked, that they've really come back very quickly. And so that is also not necessarily the experience of stock market investors over longer periods of time. And now you're in a situation where like 40% of the S&P 500 is in 10 highly valued stocks. And so there's a certain element of risk that comes with that valuation, whether you think it's appropriate or not, but there's an element of risk. And the other element of it is that you're not really so diversified. If 40% of the market's in 10 stocks, in particular, high tech stocks, and therefore you're not getting a lot of diversification in that. In terms of that mistake, then I would say is that people have to evaluate truly what the risk is in their holdings.
Right. That actually makes so much sense. I'm trying to think about what I have and how I'm going to have to diverse it as well. Maybe need to make an appointment with you, Ben. How
All
does
right. Please.
how does this relate to those who are planning or just beginning their retirement?
Right. So one of the most important principles in investment and having an investment portfolio is making sure that your investments are appropriate and that your risks in your portfolio are appropriate for your investment horizon. And generally, the stock markets have gone up and given a nice return over longer periods of time, but that can entail, significant declines and declines, which can be depressed for a very, very long time. And so if you're a young person starting a career and you're investing for retirement, you don't need that money and you're not planning on accessing it, you can let it ride. And part of the whole upward trend entails, declines. The problem is that if someone's approaching retirement, your investment horizon is contracting, and you could be in a situation where it's out of sync with the, sort of declines and rises in the stock market. And you can be in a situation where you end up having to spend money that when the market's down, and if you've spent it, or if you've become concerned because it's contracted and therefore you've sold it or reduced the risk in the portfolio, it's very hard to recoup, the value of your portfolio over time because those investments that really grow over time are not there, and it can really impair, sort of a plan. I have another client who he was a gentleman who, 30 years ago got effectively one stock from, a family member, and he of his own in coming to us was a realization that really probably had too much risk in that, and that it really needed to be diversified out of the one stock to a more broadly diversified group of stocks, maybe globally, as well as into bonds, and then also to the extent they're living, in Israel, into shekels. I think that's really, I think one of sort of the biggest risk for people who are transitioning to retirement, where the investment horizons and their ability to bear risk has been reduced, and it has to be acknowledged and reflected in their portfolio. Often people are like, oh, they don't want to miss the next, 10% up, but believe me, I think another bias that we have is that people have a greater a preference for they're more risk averse than they are greedy often. And so I think that if they were mindful of the risks and losses they could sustain, they would come to the conclusion that they ought to they have to make sure that that their portfolio is appropriately structured.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That really does. What about those people that are retiring in Israel, though?
Right. So in Israel, I mentioned that I sort of alluded to it before, is the fact is that there is a well observed bias in investors is that they have a home bias. In Israel, the stock market's like 0.2% of the world. So generally, especially in the last, since I've come to Israel in the last 20 years, people are much more well diversified globally than they had been. But now the United States, which say had been about 50% of the stock market over long periods of time, averaged about that low 50s, is now approaching 70%. And then often they're overweight the US. And so when you come to Israel, so if you live in a particular market and you have a home bias, so there's currency matching, it's not necessarily as bad as if there are greater risks to be in a different market and have a very substantial overweight to say, to another market, in this case, the US. So because the stock market in the United States has done so well, and because the US dollar has been so strong, people have benefited from that, and that's great. But and we don't know what outcomes are going to be at any given point. That my our mantra is let's have best practices. Let's institute discipline and principles that will have the best chance of over time addressing a variety of risks that we face. Which so to the extent that someone comes to Israel and then has a huge overweight to the United States market, right? Then that can go down, and you don't have the currency matching with the shekels, as well as then if they have a large bond allocation in U.S. dollars. People may remember in 2022 when the dollar went to 310, and so then your purchasing power was greatly diminished. So in terms of the stock market, then hopefully that grows over time. But if you have all your money, your bond allocation, low risk sitting in dollars, and then the dollar drops to 310 and interest rates go to 2%, and then trying to cover, shekel expenses it can become more of a challenge. And so, I mean, I think that's the re-education. People are warned, oh, don't bring your money to Israel, don't invest in Israel. And there are certain elements that, I would agree with that, or you certainly have to be careful. But to have low risk shekel bonds where there's, hopefully not a lot of volatility in the asset, not a lot of volatility in the currency is a great way to sort of give yourself a base of, shekel income to sort of match your needs.
I totally agree with that, especially since if you're living here, your costs of living is going to be here. It's good to have something here that you can, liquidate if needed or take some money out if needed, not having to go to the US and make that transfer of money, which also takes time and costs. I totally agree with that.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
as we've discussed, in addition to the actual investments held, there's also other important considerations in how investments are held in time of transition. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
I think investors often have a tendency to accumulate accounts and over time. And so you could have too many accounts and then or accounts that really don't serve a purpose and add a level of complexity to administering your affairs, and also for transferring money. And so we have clients. Some clients have very elaborate systems. They pull at this time of year from this IRA and this time of year at that IRA, and then they move it from one account to another, and then they convert it over there and they move it to Israel. And so, this is not unique to Israel, but I think it's exasperated for people who move to Israel, where they leave their affairs in place in the United States. It could be you end up with an institution that won't allow you to stay there because you no longer live in the United States, but the it becomes much more complicated or to sort of administer those accounts, and that really becomes an issue when the person who devised the plan and sort of is most comfortable with it is no longer able to administer that, and that falls to a spouse or children or some other confidant to be able to administer their affairs. And then you're sort of people can one the those people may not even have access officially to those accounts, and then you have to start getting your ipui koach mitmashech, right? The power of attorney, and get it in place, and then have it brought and validated in the United States. And it's at a time when maybe you need money. Those are some of the the issues. I mean, I would think on the Israeli side is something that you're involved with very much, whether it be wills, I think, and the power of attorneys. On the U.S. side, living trusts. I'd say, if you have a couple and they're a joint account and one passes, then the other person generally, I've heard otherwise occasionally, but generally will maintain access to their account. But if now you have a surviving spouse who's no, and then something happens to them, if it's not set up in a living trust, which is not for tax planning, but simply to avoid probate, then monies in the States can be, tied up for a very, very long time. And so these are things that require serious attention as well.
Absolutely. That's so true. Whenever I have clients, a lot of my clients recently have been ones that made Aliyah later in life, and most of their assets are still in America, but they live here and they have maybe an apartment or two and they have a bank account. And then they're thinking about, okay, but I have my estate planning all in America. It's all sorted out. And they need to also realize that they need to do something here. I mean, silly things like trusts in America, which is very common for probate purposes, needs to be thought through regarding how it's going to work out for tax purposes here. And their will in America might not be the right way completely to do when you have assets here as well. It might be more beneficial to have two wills. I mean, those things that not necessarily everybody thinks about from a bureaucratic point of view and also from a legal point of view, just to make it easier, either for the surviving spouse and definitely for the children to be able to handle afterwards. It's a big thing that should be discussed as well. So I totally understand what you're saying. Um,
Right. And so, yeah, I would just now, pick up on some of that. I'll give you as sort of an example of someone we helped this
sure.
year where, her husband had managed the investments for decades, and the wife, who was a very capable woman, but not active in this space. And they ended up with, four IRAs and three joint accounts in the United States and across three different brokerage firms. And they had been, and so in terms of the work that was involved was going through restructuring her portfolio. There were sort of legacy positions that, clearly had not done well, some that had done very, very well, became outsized. And in a matter of going through and restructuring your portfolios, one thing I'll just give a little note to the extent that people have charitable, aspirations or plans, then gifting appreciated stocks a very tax efficient way to make gifts as well as to offset, gains you may realize from other highly appreciated stocks. So there's really efficient ways to do that. Um, this client had a will and an extended power of attorney in Israel, but didn't have a living trust in the United States. So then if she was left with the accounts in her own name, the family would face, probate if she passed, with all of her assets there. And also they had been in the habit, and I think we've talked about this, many clients who, have been funding their expenses with their credit cards.
Yes.
But if you start thinking if the, in this case, son or a daughter-in-law are going to be responsible for, managing her care and need access to money, and there's no money in the bank in Israel, and you have to get a credit card in the States, and what if that balance runs low? And so I think there's a lot of good merits, though often people are advised otherwise, to have an account here. It doesn't have to be the bulk of your estate, but just to be able to make sure that whoever is going to, whatever of your assets are going to be relied on if you became incapacitated, or once you passed, that certain family members will require quicker access to the funds. I think it makes sense to have the portfolios here in Israel. I mentioned the desire and the objectives and benefits of having a shekel portfolio, but they could also be, a global portfolio. And so I would just say one of things that we've had a number of clients do is later, and they're looking at, some are, quite a bit older, and some actually not even retired, but looking at the whole families in Israel, and they don't want their whole family to have problems getting their assets, access to the assets in the States. And then we are actually able even to move, highly appreciated intact portfolios from the United States into banks in Israel, where the children will be able to have access to those monies, probably much quicker, and the whole administration of their estate will be much quicker to do it here in Israel.
That's so important. That's so important. I have clients that don't even have a credit card here in Israel. They have a very small account. They don't even have a credit card. When I ask them, okay, so how do you do transactions? How do you pay your bills? Oh, we do it through our credit card in America, and it, linked to our American accounts in the US. And I'm thinking, and it takes them a while to understand that that's all very good maybe when you're doing it, but when the children are going to need to do it, if they're going to need to do it on your behalf, then it's going to be much more complicated. It makes much more sense to have a credit card here and more money here. So I really relate to what you're saying. And if you're also, giving that feedback from the financial point of view, then that's excellent. That's very helpful. Which actually eases to my next question regarding often experienced financial advisors also lead the coordination with the client's legal advisors, and then that eases the process in that way. And can you address some of those elements?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, some people independently realize the elements, they need a will or they need and they need these days, I think the familiarity with the idea of an extended power of attorney of the Puy Koch Mitmashech, I think that that's more broadly understood. And so early on, we were encouraging clients to do it really before people knew about it because it was a new thing here. But then also the whole issue of living trusts and just thinking about how should things be structured. Often, everybody, in one sense, everyone's a practitioner. So in one sense, I'm a practitioner of managing portfolios, and we actually have a portfolio management company. But the perspective we bring is much, much broader, and I think more similar in other markets where we're trying to make sure that the clients are going to have, all their bases covered. And so a lot of the value we can add is just to know the right questions to ask and the right professionals to go to get those answers. And so, often a CPA won't know to ask, by the way, I mean, on a total other matter, in terms of a US person investing in PFIX. Often now people are more familiar, but often like the US accountant didn't even know that the person owned things that were not, tax efficient. And we're in a position where we're really trying to do a deep, very, very deep and broad dive about what, people have. And we know the questions to ask our clients that often they won't bring. And then, I just had a client who was like, "Oh, I'm going to put more money into Kupat Gemel," and I'm like, but you really probably don't want to do that. You should check with your CPA. He's like, "Oh, I spoke to my CPA. He said I'm okay." So then he would send another email to his CPA who said, "Yes, those are fine." And he sent me the email. I'm like, it said to myself, the CPA definitely didn't understand the question. So then I followed up with the CPA that it's not pre-tax money, it's after-tax money. He's like, "Oh, I wish the client would have told me the whole story, and then I would have given him a totally different answer." And so, and so those types of things can often dwarf the value of portfolio returns and fees, and can be tremendous sources of value for clients that we try to provide.
It's really good. So basically, what you're saying, you sort of have a very holistic approach when you come to a family
Yeah.
and you just not discuss just the financials, but also, how they're going to go about doing it, not just them themselves, but also the family at large and how they're going to continue. And if there's tax issues and a CPA might be involved and all, that's really good. That's super important. So
Right. I would say, I mean, I think that we're uniquely positioned in that we are active in the United States and we're active in Israel. And therefore, we have a very broad view of, what the options are in each and sort of how to sort of put it together as a puzzle to sort of come up with the best overall solution.
that's really
I mean,
good.
by the way, one thing we didn't talk about here is, also, I mean, I think people know about a tax holiday, but they don't necessarily know there are some strategies that can be very valuable for people who are on the tax holiday. And, I don't know that they necessarily come up in just a simple conversation with a CPA, because it's not obvious sometimes what can be done. And, we have the advantage also of working with a variety, we work with many CPAs and attorneys. And so, each one has their own strength and each one's suitable for a different type of client. But more than once, I'll have done something with one client, and therefore I know about the strategy in whatever sphere it is to be able to then help another client with it, where, there was no one else identifying that as sort of being relevant for them.
That's so super important. That's really super important to be able to actually know what questions to ask, as you said, and be able to refer them to the right people to be able to help them. That's very good. Well, that was a lot. Can you summarize the important things that you do now then to help us?
Absolutely. So I would say now summarize two things. I mean, one is how do we help our client? How do we serve our clients? Principally, again, we're trying to help them manage through their lives and transitions, and we do that in three main ways. And one is to provide really sort of global and shekel investment expertise. The second is to provide peace of mind where a family knows that there's someone who's got their back. I have a client, very successful individual. He's like, Ben's got my back, and that's, I think that is very valuable for people who can't do it themselves or don't want to do it themselves or professionally, very involved in what they do otherwise, and they just need to know that someone's paying attention. And the last is, and also very, very important, is to ensure continuity for a spouse or a family member. So we have clients, you know, where one spouse is very involved, has a very intricate plan, another, the other spouse is not really able to deal with that. And so we're there to help them. And I would just say, in terms of summarizing sort of the takeaways, I think the most important takeaways for clients here in general is that they have to consult, with knowledgeable tax and legal advisors who have expertise, with cross-border matters and that are sensitive to them. They should really, and especially today, the dollar's so high, stock market's so high. It's a great time to review the portfolio if you have large exposures in those markets and make sure that you're not taking more risk that than you should. Even, and then lastly, that to ensure that your account structures are your accounts are structured in a way that it would make it easier to administer for your spouse or children or other confident, whoever it might be.
Oh, that's really good to
Thank you so much.
oh, that was actually very good. That was very good the way you summarized it. So, well, thank you, Ben, for being us with us tonight. That was really super helpful. Thank you for all you guys that were watching us. Have a good night. Stay safe. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next podcast.